Good morning. Is it loud enough? Let's see if Brian. Oh, yeah, right. Give us a moment. We want to make sure that you can hear me as well as possible.
I have it turned all the way up. So.
Okay. Well, this is what we're going to do then. I'll project. Good morning. Thank you all for being here on the second day of this amazing conference. I am LaToya Baldwin-Clark. I am the faculty director of the Critical Race Studies program here at UCLA. CRS acknowledges our presence on the traditional, ancestral, unceded lands and waterways of the Gabrielino and Tongavar peoples, past, present, and emerging. We are committed to actively engaging and learning about the history of the lands we occupy, how to be better stewards of them, and continue to honor with intention and respect the historical and current significance of the enduring relationship between the Gabrielino and Tongva peoples and the space that CRS occupies. So as the first law school program in the United States dedicated to critical race theory in legal education and related disciplines, the Critical Race Studies program is unequaled in American legal education. The cornerstone of the program is the CRS specialization, a competitive academic course of study engaging students who are committed to racial justice, scholarship, and legal practice, to being rebellious. And we have several of our students here today who are volunteering, and we thank them very much. The CRS specialization enhances coursework with a variety of collaborative and interdisciplinary experiences to integrate theory and practice. I lost my place. There we go. Many rebellious lawyers trained at UCLA and elsewhere have been heavily influenced by the teachings and the concepts of critical race theory. But since the waning days of the Trump presidency and through the present, CRT has been under an unprecedented attack. The summer of 2020's mass mobilization against police violence and anti-Blackness threatened a racial reckoning, where various government officials, nonprofit leaders, school boards, and even businesses declared anti-racism to be a core value. But since September 2020, 229 entities across the country at the local, state, and federal level have introduced over 750 anti-CRT measures. Our initiative, called CRT Forward, has been tracking these efforts, including local school board resolutions, state attorneys general's letters, and legislation, among other types. Through these measures, curriculum is being changed, teachers and administrators are being fired and disciplined, and books are being taken off the shelves, all an attack on the right to teach and children's rights to learn. This assault is a reminder of the reform retrenchment cycle identified by CRT to explain why, after many hard-fought victories in the courts and elsewhere, racial oppression, as well as gender oppression, class oppression, and other oppressions continue to persist. CRS at UCLA sees itself as an important entity in this fight. The depth and the breadth of this attack shows how crucial it is for rebellious lawyers, the type of lawyers CRT seeks to train and educate, need to continue the fight against oppression, including white supremacy, in solidarity with marginalized communities. So we are very, very honored to host the symposium in honor of our friend and colleague, Jerry Lopez. I hope that today and yesterday gives us all the strength and the courage to continue to be rebellious in whatever space we find ourselves. Thank you. Thank you, LaToya.
I'm Jasleen Coley, and I am the Executive Director of the Critical Race Studies Program, and it is so wonderful to see you all here today. I just want to acknowledge a few folks. As you know, it takes a village to put on an event of this kind. It takes a village to create transformative change, and it takes a village to create the type of beloved community that's here today. There's a number of programs, including the UCLA Luskin Institute's Center for Inequality and Democracy, a number of other programs at the law school, including the Emmett Institute, Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy, the Institute for Technology Law and Policy, the Center for Reproductive Health Law and Policy, International and Comparative Law Program, the Resnick Center for Food Law and Policy, and UCLA's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Program, and lastly, our Office of the Dean, who have all supported this program to come together. I know that we've mentioned several times that this program was first conceptualized way back, actually prior to 2019, probably like around maybe 2018 or even before. We've been in discussions for this, and actually I just realized as I left my 4.5-year-old for the last few days that I've been thinking about this program longer than she's been in existence. In March 2020, as you all know, we got the call on Tuesday to cancel everything that was supposed to happen on Thursday. Unfortunately, we even had one person who didn't get the messages and still showed up. But we're so sorry. We're so glad you're still here with us today, and are not terribly upset with us. And we know in these past 3 years, so much has happened, that there's been a tremendous amount of change, that there's been a tremendous amount of loss. There are people who can't be here today, some for logistical reasons, and some for sadder reasons. And I just want to mention two of them as we have our alums here. Yesterday was just really, really so beautiful for me to see so many of our alums. Later today, we're going to have several of our alums on a panel. We have one of our other alums here, Alina, who is on our upcoming panel, and we just have such an incredible community of students and alumni here. Two who really fall in the Rebellious tradition, who can't be here today, one of whom, Ava Hernandez, you can read about in the program. And I think we have at least one member of the coalition to free Ava Hernandez in the back, Claudia, who you can talk to if you'd like to support in any way. The other person I'd like to who also should have been here today, Hamad Alam, who is a 2014 graduate and most recently worked at the Asian Law Caucus after a long career in advocating on those who've been marginalized. Unfortunately, he passed just a couple of days ago, and I just wanted to just mark that. As far as the rebellious spirit, I've heard I've gotten so many messages from various alums sharing stories about how much he meant to them. Even people who didn't know him very well had shared how he was just such a gentle and kind spirit, and many people said that he was an active member of the Muslim Law Students Association here at UCLA, and tried to basically get all of the students in the association to join CRS, and was a huge advocate of CRS. And unfortunately, he left us far, far too soon, and our thoughts go out to his family, and especially his 6-month-old daughter, Inara, and we hold them in our hearts, and we think about Hamid as we go forward on this day. With that, I just want to celebrate all of you who are here with us today. I said it takes a village, but there are always certain people who put in a lot of blood, sweat, and tears into making something happen, hopefully just figuratively and not literally. I don't know what's happened behind the scenes with Sharad trying to put this together, but I want to turn it over to one of the principal organizers of this program, who really, really just put a tremendous amount of effort and time and energy into pulling this together. So I'll turn it over to Sharad Thaxton.
Thank you, Jasleen. Again, thank
everyone for joining this event this morning. I do want to echo again the land acknowledgement of the Gabrielino and Tonga peoples. I have a limited amount of time to speak, and I'm going to speak about Jerry, and if I don't stick to the script, it'll be forever, and I'll start branching off talking about sports and everything else. And so I apologize. This is a little more muted in terms of a presentation that I would normally talk about my brother Jerry. So my name is Sherrod Thaxton. I'm a professor here at UCLA Law, as well as a faculty member in the Critical Race Studies program and the Epstein Program in Public Interest Law and Policy, also known as PILP. This past summer, I completed a 3-year term as the faculty director of the PILP program. And this past spring, PILP completed its 25th anniversary. The program now boasts more than 800, alum, many of whom are tirelessly engaging in anti-subordination lawyering. Now, when I served as director, I would provide prospective students with a brief overview of the PILP program, discussing its origins, curriculum, mentoring, current faculty, and presence in the social justice community, locally, nationally, and globally. Because there were so many things to cover in those sessions, my description was necessarily brief, and as a consequence, I was unable to properly acknowledge the tireless efforts of the wonderful founding faculty of the PILP program. So today I'll have a little more time and the platform to talk a bit more about one of the founding faculty members of PILP and the invaluable role that person played in helping PILP become what it is today, my brother Jerry Lopez. Jerry has summed up the purpose of PILP perfectly, and I quote, "The purpose of creating the program was to make the school experience not just about the law, but about learning specific dimensions of lawyering, especially for those planning to work with subordinated communities." In order to understand what Jerry infused in UCLA's public interest community and the PILP program, it's important to know a little bit more about his journey. When you ask the typical law professor or the typical law graduate, what does one learn in law school? They often admit that one doesn't really learn the law, rather they learn how to think and write like a lawyer, that is legal analysis and writing. But what you often don't hear is that most law schools do an inadequate job of teaching the very things students, especially those interested in public interest law, come to law school to learn, and that's lawyering skills. Jerry has worked tirelessly to change that. So let's talk a bit about his journey. And forgive me, Jerry, if I mess up a detail here and there. Trust me, there's a lot of moving parts. You correct me afterwards. All right? You will. So prior to coming to UCLA, as a young lawyer in San Diego, Jerry engaged in anti-subordination work of all types: criminal defense, immigration work, anti-discrimination, civil rights, and community advising, while also teaching at California Western Law School, where he transformed his legal research and writing course into a first-year lawyering course and taught a simulated clinic on employment discrimination. He was then recruited by UCLA and transformed his contracts course into a lawyering course by teaching students how contract law can be used to help clients in their everyday lives to problem solve. His colleague and collaborator at UCLA, Allison Anderson, extended this approach to her torts class. And Jerry and Allison got the permission of several of their colleagues here at UCLA who taught criminal law, property, civil procedure, to allow them to do lawyering-based simulations and role play in their classes, focusing on real-life problems and cases. And issues of race, gender, poverty figured prominently in their work. Their goal was simple. Actual lawyering would always be at the front and center, and substantive law was in the background. News of Jerry's brilliant work spread fast, and very soon after arriving at UCLA, he was being recruited by the law schools at Stanford and Harvard. And one of the things that really stood out about Jerry was his focus on learning the deep history of communities being served as it relates to a multitude of issues and problems. And how to understand those issues was central to collaborating with those communities as equal partners in problem solving. Unsurprisingly, both Stanford and Harvard made tenure offers to Jerry. Not tenure track, tenured offers to Jerry. And after 4 years at UCLA, Jerry headed to Stanford. but he insisted that he only wanted to teach clinics of his own creation that were rooted in his view of the centrality of serious immersion in and learning from those communities being served. At Stanford, he co-developed a 3-year sequence and coordinated curriculum for lawyering and outreach, consisting in part of live and simulated clinics and focusing on poor communities all over the Bay Area. The goal was simple: work with the communities to change the everyday conditions in their lives. Criminal injustice, occupational health and safety, overtime pay, pension, daily wage labor, you name it. Informing communities about the law and its possibility for problem solving was also a big component of his work. After a decade at Stanford, Jerry returned to UCLA, and it was during this time he and other faculty at UCLA helped start the PILP program, based in significant part on what Jerry and Allison Anderson had done during his first stint at UCLA and on what he built at Stanford. Jerry would leave UCLA for NYU several years later. He really loved the public interest community he helped build at UCLA, but NYU offered some resources that Jerry needed to create the type of clinical programs that he knew underserved communities desperately needed. He was able to develop clinics that addressed a bunch of different populations' needs, such as prisons conditions, workplace health and safety, and access to financial services. He also recruited students from other schools and spearheaded large-scale empirical projects, both qualitative and quantitative in nature, to collect and analyze information about these communities, from these communities, and their needs. After 8 years at NYU, Jerry returned home to UCLA, focusing on live clinics and community outreach and education. He also developed a Rebellious community lawyering clinic and other intensive workshops on anti-subordination lawyering, and always with the common thread of best understanding how people approaching a problem from diverse perspectives can best organize and advocate to solve everyday problems, and always committed to obliterating those boundaries between learning and teaching in communities and learning and teaching on campuses. I've left every conversation that I've had with Jerry over the past decade that I've been at UCLA with deeper insights about social justice lawyering and a greater appreciation and admiration for what he has spearheaded both inside and outside of the ivory tower in the service of marginalized communities. My brother Jerry, PILP is because you are.
Should we start? Can you hear me? Is this on? How do you turn it on? How about there? Yes. Oh, all right. Okay, good morning. Good morning. Very happy to be here with you. I want to share a little personal story. It's just very moving to me to be here. There's a convergence of so many things. You know, we were planning this panel. This panel was planned for 2020, and we had prepared quite a bit for it. Obviously it was canceled at the very last minute, and we've all been through so much since then. But it's also meaningful to me because the last Rebellious Lawyering Conference that I attended was the one in Taos, which is also a very powerful experience. My wife, Alma Medina, and I attended that together. Alma and I celebrated our 30th wedding anniversary last year, and we actually, our journey together intersects substantially with Jerry and with Lawyering for Social Change. She's also an alum of Stanford Law School, and we both took we're students of Jerry Lopez and the Lawyering for Social Change curriculum. So, and I knew when I came to Stanford that I wanted to be a lawyer for Indian tribes, for my people. I had clerked for my tribe in Winnebago, Nebraska, in the in the tribal attorney's office. And even though I had interned, I didn't clerk, I interned. I was just graduated from college. I interned at another law firm that was a commercial and torts plaintiff's firm. I hated it. I said, I do not want to be a lawyer. But then I went and spent some time in the tribal attorney's office at my tribe, and I said, this is real stuff. These people are making life better, creating tools for my people, the tribal government, to make things better for our people. This is what I want to do. So I went to Stanford thinking, okay, I need to learn Indian law. Unfortunately, Stanford didn't have a lot of Indian law, but it was going to take me to be a lawyer. But then I started taking the Lawyering for Social Change classes, in particular the classes with Jerry. It just it really it changed how I thought about what I was going to do. Gave me so much more to think about how am I going to do my job, and how am I going to work with whom I consider my people, but I'm going to be their lawyer, and how am I going to do that in a way that is truly effective, the most effective that I can be, and how do I empower them? How are they not empowered, but and so how do I overcome that or help them overcome that? And how do I be their attorney, helping them achieve their sovereignty objectives, which they know very well what they want to do. And the questions that the rebellious lawyering work raised for me and continues to raise for me, I have informed my work at a very deep level ever since. And I was, speaking about Jerry, I was moved about how much he questioned assumptions about the law practice and doctrine, and his doggedness in finding answers that move the needle toward justice. He's been my mentor ever since, and I really think it's appropriate we have this conference after the pandemic. We're still doing it, and that we're honoring his work. So I'm really happy to be here with my colleagues on this panel to talk about a particular topic in Lawyering for Social Change, which is focusing on work to achieve fundamental transformation and demands for immediate change. I'm going to talk a little bit about what the panelists are going to discuss, but I want to share a couple of thoughts just to frame the conversation. So thinking about fundamental transformation in institutions and demanding immediate change, how much should we work towards? I think this topic presents questions about how we define our objectives, what our expectations are, and the strategy for getting there. But probably even more importantly, how we evaluate the objectives and the expectations as the work proceeds. Because one reaction that I had to the idea that, well, why don't we seek immediate transformational change? My initial reaction was, well, I think we typically do seek transformational fundamental change, and we demand it immediately. I know it certainly when I was in college and we were working for diversified curriculum, we wanted Stanford to do it right now, and it was never soon enough. And they're still working on it, it's still not enough. So the next thought that I have about that is that, well, the answer is yes, but we have to accept just as a fact of reality of that change is going to be incremental. And we have to continue to work for radical change, even as we accomplish those incremental improvements. But I also think the question goes to how big are we thinking? And maybe we're not thinking big enough. Are we asking institutions for change that they can provide, or must we eliminate the institution or change the institution in a significant way so that change that we're seeking can occur? And I was struck by Bill Hing's discussion of his book yesterday that is coming out about his what sound to me like very radical proposals for changes to the immigration system, but also very well founded. I think that those proposals and how you get to accomplishing those proposals are the kinds of things we're talking about today. But even, at least even more so, I think this topic poses questions about how we monitor progress. Many fights are long-term and require sustained effort. I have, been a lawyer since 1994, and I'm still working on things I was working on when I started. And I'm sure they will not be. The fight will continue after I'm, gone. Do we reevaluate the objectives and strategies at key points along the way? Circumstances change, and those changes may require redefinition of the objectives, which in turn will likely require change in strategy. It is not difficult to settle into a strategy for a long-term fight without reevaluation along the way. Meaning, I think it's easy you get tired, you're working towards an objective, you're making little or modest progress, and you just assume that the objective as you defined it at the outset is the right one. But after 10 years, that can't possibly be right, or at least in many instances, it's probably not right. Are we reevaluating what that objective was that we defined 10 years ago, or 5 years ago, or last year? And I suspect we don't do that enough. I guess I know that I don't. And one of the questions I ask myself about a lot of things that I work on is there more that I could do? Is there more that we can do? And are there questions we haven't asked, questions that we need to ask about what we're trying to accomplish and how do we get there? So now I want to talk about those sort of ideas in the specific context, or in the context of specific struggles. And we have an awesome panel here. We're going to start with Craig, Craig Futterman. On to my right, we're actually going to go from right to left, or my right, your left to my right, who is going to discuss his efforts to work to change the Chicago Police Department and law enforcement practices nationally. Yumari Martinez is going to talk about radical reformation of the juvenile rehabilitation / correction system in New York. Michelle Fay is going to talk about her work with Hawaii State Medicaid clients coming out of the criminal justice system, a disproportionate percentage of whom are Native Hawaiian, and perhaps her work in New York with undocumented first-time mothers. Alina Ball will discuss her work with a farm workers cooperative struggle for permanent housing. So I'm going to just turn it over to you guys and take it away.
Craig. Good morning, y'all. And good morning.
Good morning.
I got sharp elbows, and so Yamari told me to take my ass over here. Jerry knows about those elbows on the court, too. Not the only feral mob. It's late fall afternoon. I'm about to quit work for the night when my phone rings. Can y'all hear me? Yes. All right, you want me to do this? See, Sherrod too tall. Here, let me try this. Phone rings, and you see it's somebody actually from law enforcement in Chicago who's asking me for help. And they tell me about a shooting. 2 officers drive up on a 17-year-old kid, a boy who has a small knife in his hand. And within seconds from jumping out the car, one of the officers shoots the boy as the boy's shying away from the officer. Officer pauses, the boy falls to the ground, and then he adjusts his aim like this. And he literally unloads his entire magazine into the boy's body as he's writhing on the ground. 16 shots. 16. They tell me it looks like an execution. They shot that boy like he was a dog in the street. They saw the video. And the word that the shooting's already being covered up, like so many others, like Craig, you got to help me do something about this. We got to keep this from getting buried. We got to stop this mess. Y'all might know the boy's name was Laquan McDonald. More than 25 years before I got that call, though, I'm sitting with a small group of some of the coolest folk I'd ever met in law school. Jerry's Section 1983 Lawyering Theory class, and we're reading a manuscript, a working draft of what would later become Rebellious Lawyering. Now, I'm a Chicago boy, as some folk here know, to the core. But as far back as I can remember, I was California dreaming, though, and a lot of you California folk. But not for any grand reasons, though. Shit, I mean, it's like as a kid, images of sun, palm trees. All right, I'm not gonna lie, girls. You know, shit you see on TV and the movies, because those images seem like the other side of the world from what I knew. So I was always talking trash about one day I'm finna move to Cali. I'm gonna move to Cali. And my boys would throw it right back at me too. My boys would be like, the only California you're going to, brother, is 26 in California. Some of y'all know what 26 in California is? That's the county jail in Chicago. That's the county jail. So it wasn't that funny. So I was far from the smartest or the most talented kid in my neighborhood, but for real, my lighter skin protected me from a life inside that 26 in California. Or worse, human cages, early graves that are filled by all too many people who I love. But if I'm one thing, y'all, I'm persistent. Some folks might say hard-headed. The more people told me I could, the more determined I was to go, right? Come hell or high water, I'm going to Cali. And in my young 20s, I made it, right? And I arrived in the San Francisco Bay Area to go of all places, Stanford Law School. And I mean, everyone, including my butt, was like, what the fuck am I doing here? Somebody must have slipped up. And we were talking about imposter syndrome yesterday. I was bound to be found out. And I arrived with the dream of becoming a public defender, particularly to work with kids, but for the grace of God go on, right? And the Lawyering for Social Change program, this is his very first year, I believe, led by Jerry and Bill and later by so many others. Shauna's here. Yup. That became law school for me. They made sure that I no longer felt like an imposter, like I had purpose. I also can't lie, because after a minute, I was also kind of like Jerry, like, is that all you got? Stanford, that's all you got? Fast forward, 10 years later, after sitting in Jerry's classroom, I get a call from another hero of mine, another mentor, Randolph Stone. I was back in California after serving as a juvenile public defender in Chicago, and I'm now teaching, actually, back at Stanford. I'm teaching and I'm leading public interest programs there. My wife, Kenyatta, our two preschool-aged daughters at the time, Elijah and Asha, we're about to get on a plane headed to D.C. where we're about to move. And Randolph calls and he says, this may not be the best timing, but you know that clinic we've been talking about? I'm on the next plane. I'm on the next plane to Chicago. And so if y'all don't know Randolph, and I know a lot of y'all might not know Randolph, you should. You really should. First black person ever to head the public defender's office in Chicago. And after transforming that office from top to bottom, he became the first non-white law professor to teach at, much less to lead the Mandel Clinic at the University of Chicago. Also a place, as Sherrod had noted yesterday, that hadn't been very hospitable to black people, right? Understand. I got more. I'll quote you in a second. So during his time there, this is before I got there, Randolph and I, though, shared a vision of creating this law school civil rights clinic that focused on race and the police, something that didn't exist anywhere else. This is long before like Michael Brown, Ferguson, before like people started, at least white people started paying attention to this. A clinic that would support people, the work of people fighting for freedom from racist and brutal policing, while teaching law students all that it means to be a lawyer. So we're talking about, Sherrod, at the motherfucking University of Chicago Law School. And what Sherrod called yesterday, the last bastion of white supremacy? It was one of them, at least. So talk about something that's both right, transgressive, transformative. I mean, when we dream kind of big, right? Oh yeah, can you hit me up? Thank you. So after countless hours talking to anybody and everybody, I mean anybody and everybody, about how we can best contribute, we formed a partnership, and you can see some photos, with people who lived in a high-rise public housing community called Stateway Gardens, and that's where some of my boys who I grew up with, I used to play ball with. And community made up of 8 square blocks of Chicago's South Side, situated about just 10 minutes from campus where the law school was. Since then, the entire community has since been disappeared by an Orwellian government project called the Plan for Transformation, spearheaded by none other than Chicago's infamous Mayor Richie Daley. A policy of demolishing public housing communities to reclaim the land for the more, let's say, well-heeled. And I hope these photos, which as I talk, will give you a flavor of my city, my people, a sense of just the vitality, the vibe, the spirit, the soul of the Stateway Gardens community as the mayor tried to make our people disappear. So I was first really skeptical. Police accountability clinic, right? How's that going to provide much of anything in the way of value to a community that's fighting for its very existence? But people living there taught us that racist and brutal policing were necessary and central features of the city's land clearance policy at Stateway, as practice using the police as part of its fundamental practice for disappearing the black people there. Folks trashed out a vacant ground floor apartment, and it was being used actually then as a dope house, and then they converted it as productive working space for us, and we became squatters there, de facto squatters. And that post on the ground, we built something that we call the Stateway Civil Rights Project, kind of a human rights documentation advocacy project. And it really, I should give Jerry this, because you can see we're trying our damnedest now, right? To put those lessons I learned from Jerry into action. So our fluid, like multi-means, bottom up, top down, crossways, sideways, diagonals. Y'all know the shit. Collaborations that will make your head spin. That is if you're doing it right. That is if you're doing it right. Well, anyways, that's our second home. Among the folks that we come to meet at Stateway is a woman by the name of Diane, 50-year-old public school janitor. Mom, single mom, always seemed to have a kind word and something that I deeply appreciated. Always had some delicious food for her neighbors, and she treated me as a neighbor. Then we just stopped seeing her. The friendly face, smell of her home-cooked meals, just nowhere to be found, right? And it turns out that over the course of a year, a team of 5 Chicago police tactical officers subjected Diane to a series of repeated assaults on her body, her person, her home, her family, her religion. They threatened her with a loaded gun, needle-nose pliers, screwdriver, leaving her convinced that they were just going to rape or kill her. They beat and choked her. They beat her teenage son. On one occasion, they even brought a middle-aged neighbor into her home and then forced her teenage son to beat the older black man just for their amusement, like a staged cockfight. We knew these assholes. We saw them on a daily, and what distinguished them above all was their overt racism, the particular pleasure they took in their racist acts. They really got their jollies off of abusing black folk. And most of all, they knew that they could do this in impunity. Nothing's ever going to happen to them. So we didn't conceive, so we back to Rebellious and whatnot, we didn't conceive of the Stateway Partnership or anything like a litigation project, much less a traditional litigation project, but we did wound up using litigation as at least one tool in the fight, not the end-all or be-all, but a tool. And we began to see how litigation as a tool could support community-led advocacy to challenge apartheid justice at Stateway. So we bring a civil rights lawsuit with Diane, and we didn't just sue the sadistic racist who had been torturing her. We also sued City Hall. We sued the system for creating and maintaining that system of impunity that allowed the Skullcap crew to do exactly what they had been doing to Diane and her neighbors. So I got to give Sherrod another shot, because speaking of using some crazy wonky tools in a fight, we use everything, right? And this may sound nerdy and wonky. Sorry, Sherrod, but part of our lawsuit, one of the things we did, data. We got 6 years of data about every single complaint of when Chicago police officers of brutality, racism, sexual abuse, and I can say this now, I can stand tall because Sherrod yesterday made data cool. But I don't have his chops. I don't pretend to have his chops. But we use this quote unquote, and I'll use air quotes, scientific evidence that held sway in the white world, right, to support the realities that we were experiencing on the ground. And while that data didn't reveal a damn thing that people at Stateway, people on the ground hadn't known for years, it made it, and particularly because of the department's own data, it made it really difficult for public officials to deny the reality there. And the data showed exactly why and how Skullcap crew could do what they did. It showed that the odds of actually them ever being disciplined were like 0. They showed how complaints of serious abuse, like, they were made to disappear. Come in dirty, come out clean. Antithesis of a broken system. I mean, this is a system that is doing exactly what it was designed to do. So I can move it now. So cities fighting public exposure of all this shit. Every turn. Federal courts try to shut us down. That door closes. Let's try to pry open another door. We go to state courts. We take our fight there. We bring like a Public Information Act lawsuit. Another tool, seeking public access now. And truth is, this is more as Jerry preached, we're fighting multiple fronts at the same time, right? Courts and the streets and the jails and the prison, academic debates in the media, we're writing. And you know what? For the next 18 months, we changed the narrative. We framed the public conversations in the media, not the mayor, not the police. Instead of stories about what you're reading now, out of control crime in Chicago, right. Front page headlines read, what are they hiding? What is the Chicago Police Department hiding? Straight, 18 months, New York Times, everywhere. We even, well, I don't have time for that story. But in the courts then, we established the legal precedent in Illinois that police misconduct records belong to the people. And I say police misconduct records, I mean everything. We got like more than 50 years of records from every complaint and the investigation of every complaint. And to bring it home, because it's one thing to win a legal precedent, it's another thing to try to make it real, we launched what's now, this is wonky too, but we launched what's known as the Citizens Police Data Project, which is a public database that gives everybody, I mean everyone, access to information about every single police misconduct complaint in Chicago, cpdp.co, check it out. When you think about it, right, fundamental redistribution of power, from whom? From police to the people. That's the point. And folk everywhere have been using this tool. Even in California, people have been using this tool. But while we're winning this, we're winning the public and legal arguments at this point. You know what, though? Our people are losing their homes. Far more. At the same time, we're generating these headlines. What are they hiding? The city's literally bulldozing the Stateway Gardens community. Perhaps the cruelest irony is that the city succeeded in its $1.6 billion project planned to demolish Stateway before we actually won the legal fight that created an official record documenting the realities there. The city destroyed, literally, the city destroyed the scene of the crime, the scene of what they were doing. All right, so let me bring it home, because I know Colin's saying, shut the F up. It's in this context, because I gotta, go back to where I start. That's how I was taught too. It was in that context that I got that phone call that I talked about from law enforcement. Tell me about the Chicago Police Department's attempt to try to cover up, to hide that video, to cover up the murder of 17-year-old Laquan McDonald. Now, I don't have time to share the story with y'all today, but the upshot is, for months and months, nobody gave a damn about our cries of the execution of a 17-year-old boy, a black boy, by a white Chicago police officer. But we're persistent. We won the public release of that video. Video police killing the kids also belongs to the people. And young black folks' use of that video, that video of Officer Jason Van Dyke, let's call names, Jason Van Dyke, pumping those 16 shots into Laquan's body as he lay bleeding on the street, that contributed to a national awakening. An awakening to the reality of police abuse, systemic police abuse in black and brown communities, and machinery of denial that legitimate and justify, or seek to legitimize and justify police violence against black people. All right, so local prosecutor, they got no choice now, but they got to file charges against this officer, right? Police chief fired, state's attorney, she's ousted from office to be replaced by Kim Fox, first black woman ever to hold the office, and Kim has since overturned, I don't care what you think about Kim, but she's overturned more than 130 convictions because of Chicago police abuse since she's been in office. Mayor Rahm Emanuel, gone. And the U.S. Department of Justice, who have been like, they got no choice too, to finally respond to our years-long cries, get your asses to Chicago. And Van Dyke, ultimately convicted of murder, making it the first time ever, and at this time, and I shit you not, that Chicago police were killing on average one person a week. And the one thing that hasn't changed over the course of 40 years is that who are the people who they're killing? More than 8% every year, black. First time ever that Chicago police officer ever been held criminally accountable for killing a black person, notwithstanding everything I just said. All right, so this is now like celebrate, and glamorize and shit like that. So y'all know our story doesn't end there, and because we don't live in a fairy tale. I don't have to tell anybody in this room that we remain mired in the kind of backlash that has followed every period of progress in our fight for racial justice. That's Diane. We're fighting for the soul of my city. Over my past 23 years in this law school clinic, I mean, we've done some things right, done a lot wrong too, stumbled a lot along the way. But there's one thing that we've never forgotten, and I mean, Jerry was a big part about this. One thing we've never forgotten is that we're in a fight. A fight for our lives, a fight for our ancestors. I got little kids. I don't have little kids, but a fight for our children. A fight for each other, really. If there's one thing that I've learned in these 23 years, right, it's that things don't change by themselves. They change only when we make them change. I love you, brother. I love y'all. Peace.
One, two, 1, 2. Yes. No, I'm not gonna get on the mic and start rapping. Hi everyone. My name is Yumari Martinez. Yumi. I am honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel twice, I guess. Always happy to be here, and all of you made it possible for me to see Jerry, so thank you. It's been a while. Just a little bit about me that's not in the bio. I'm Puerto Rican, de Puerto Rico, de Mayagüez, Puerto Rico. I was born in New York, raised in Brooklyn, Brooklyn all day, although I live in the Hudson Valley now. So. Don't hold that against me. I share this because I grew up in the 80s and 90s in Brooklyn, New York. It was a beautiful time. It was the birth of hip-hop. It was really taking form. And so many wonderful things were happening. But it was also a scary time for a kid like me. And navigating worlds, a lot of the topics that have been coming out resonate because it's my lived experience, similar to many of you. Not only the imposter syndrome that people talk about, but just the lack of belonging, really trying to find my space in this world, right? I have strong parents, love them to death, and they've provided me with so much. But it's people like Jerry that have made it possible for me to live out my dreams professionally and in life. I'm going to take my opportunity here while I have the mic to go a little off script and share something that I've already shared with Jerry plenty of times, but to do it publicly because I go back to it to sort of center myself. So here goes. En busca de conciencia para estar consciente de la lucha que lleva mi gente. Revolution? Within which institution? I will not disguise my disgust and blindly trust the sagacity of their meritocracy as they hit me with their so-called Socratic philosophy. knowing full well it's embedded in intellectual hypocrisy. I spent a lifetime deconstructing my mental colony, a concerted effort by institutions to assert my inferiority, making me a footnote in the back of a book where no one would look, and you expect me to quickly acquiesce to the shit that you put in effect? Yet again, you've mistook my enrollment for enslavement, so I must protest, rebel, and rage against your intellectual self. Prison is for the prisoner, so call me an intellectual fugitive as I plan my escape from the hegemony of your race, understanding that my bilingual ability is not a skill, but a disclaimer explaining my current state. As I recall the oppressive history of my linguistic status, which ripped me of my memory of my indigenous past and has me clinging to the fusion of my Puerto Rican ass, Africa. So tell me, how long do you wish to masquerade your bureaucracy and so-called democracy in the name of your racist policies? As the streets have so eloquently said, let's be real. You steal, stole, and control. With your fictitious wealth, you have enslaved and betrayed. And like the mafia, all of you gone made. Are you dismayed by my rebellious nature? As I seem to be ungrateful for all the opportunities that you have given to me by raping my people? I apologize that I have not learned to be a good little Negro. But it's hard to appease your wicked disease and fulfill your paternalistic fantasies. Fuck that. I don't apologize. I rebel. I rebel against all that is presupposed and preconditioned. I rebel against the ordaining of Latino and black youth to a ministry of crime as you condition your laws to enslave those that rage against your police state and create a war against the urban pharmaceuticals that your capitalist structure helps to distribute. I rebel against your bullshit language, which you refer to as legalese, but is better described as hide my racism, please. You can strictly scrutinize my rights and speak of your amorphous neutrality as you continue to be racist while simultaneously proclaiming to be blind. But your intellectual disguise is no match for the rebellious nature of my eyes. As I blink, I remove each lie from blocking my sight and affirmatively decide to liberate my mind. Hopefully in liberation, justice will reside. Now that I've finished this protest homily, I can take my JD to the streets and rebelliously start my lawyering. So we were honoring Jerry, as you might imagine. It was my third year at NYU. Kind of knew that this was, well, I thought it was going to be the last time that I was going to be able to have a moment to honor him. So was up all night writing that for him. But as life would have it, it's actually been more for me, as it's reminded me constantly of sort of finding my center, my grounding, and sort of awakening the lessons that Jerry has shared with me over the years. Jerry talked about the fact that some folks he just has to get out of the way. I think I'd fall in the other bucket of I needed extra Jerry. So after I graduated from law school, I actually went back to work for Jerry, and I thought about it as my second chance at law school to learn how to be a lawyer for real this time, and under the tutelage of somebody that I love and respect, and I'm so honored to be here with. So thank you for indulging me and sharing that with you guys, and thank you, Jerry, for inspiring me all the time. What I'm going to talk about here, I'm going to talk about closing youth prisons and decarceration, but it stems from that poem, from that moment, from that time, right? I told you I'm from Puerto Rico. We are a colony, right? My people, both on the island and off the island, suffer from all the discrimination and all of the effects of being treated less than and othered. And so one of the examples of that, right, we were talking about affirmative action yesterday, and a lot of this stuff resonates, but the work that I was doing was the sort of the pre-work that they do to not even give us an opportunity to be considered for affirmative action by putting us in these cages, right? And in New York, and we can put the first, whatever the first thing is. In New York, the way I'll sort of set out the what it used to be, kids that were arrested in the city would be sent upstate New York. And this would be 3, 4, 5, 6 hours away from where they lived, and would be housed in these euphemisms of sort of training schools and stuff like that, but they were really adultified settings of incarceration, right? Where young people were in cells, they were disconnected and treated other than human, right? And in that context, it was being populated by mostly black and brown New York City youth, right? So these are the kids that I grew up with, right? And so you can see from this slide, I think it's, I can't read from over there, but around 2006, there was like 1,000 plus kids that were being removed from New York City and were being sent to all these upstate facilities. There were probably like 30 of them at the time. They were not only being removed from those settings, but there was all these failures associated with that removal, right? And so not only were they detached from their families, they were not engaged in schooling that they would get credit for when they returned back home. Everybody returns back home. It was one of the mantras that when I was working with Jerry, we would talk about all the time is that, the idea that incarceration and incapacitation is going to solve anything, right, is problematic, right, to say the least. And so they weren't preparing for young people to succeed. They were preparing to further damage our young people and alienate them, right? And so around this time, I actually leave working for Jerry and have to go fend for myself. And I end up at the Vera Institute of Justice, which I would not say is the most radical, but it is one of the institutions that has been trying to make change in criminal justice for decades. And they had a youth justice component at the time, and so I signed up and I said, let's try to do this work, right? The key to that moment was they had formed a partnership with a new leader in the state, Gladys Cajon, a Puerto Rican woman from the Bronx, who I work with till this day, another strong mentor of mine. And she, right away, smartly and adeptly said, I'm not going to own these institutions as they exist today. All these ills, all this stuff, I'm going to expose it as the commissioner of the state. And so she welcomed the DOJ. She welcomed legal aid to file suits, to sue her. She would tell advocates, sue me, ask for this information. In that process, what she was saying is, I want to put a light on something that people have been keeping in the dark, right? And I'm not going to own all this oppression that's been happening to the young people that she grew up around as well. And so in that process, we can go to the next slide. Try to see if I can follow along here. Yeah, okay. So you see a timeline, right? So I want to dispel right from the beginning. This didn't happen in overnight, right? This has been a long sort of struggle to get to where we got, and it's an imperfect struggle, right? But basically what ends up happening is she says, I want to do everything in my power to expose what's currently going, and then I want to reimagine what could be, right? And at the center of it, she goes to me and says, and I want to close prisons. And I was like, yo, sign me up. Whatever we got to do, I'm in. And my role, I've had 5 different jobs while this has occurred, moving to what I thought was the best position to continue to help this mission, right? And so it wasn't the job itself that helped me. But at the time I was at Vera, and one of the things that Vera does well is come out with reports. We formed a task force with the commissioner. We knew what we wanted to write, right? But we wanted to sort of document it and say it and get other people to say, yes, we're recommending this. And so in that document, it talked about the ills, but it talked about the future, right? What could we create instead, right? And this task force culminated in 09. By 10, there's recommendations, and there's work being done. There's collaboration across many other people. It's a sort of complicated story of the ecosystem being built imperfectly, but you're getting state actors, advocates, everybody sort of pushing in their role. And what the end result of this, right, as we sort of move to 2012, is we pilot something different in Brooklyn, right? Because I'm from Brooklyn. And so a townhouse across the street from Medgar Evers College gets converted to house young people who would be sent upstate. and the community's invited in, and what it looks like dormitory style house, right? There's no bars, none of that kind of stuff, and then rethinking what we wanted to achieve with young people, right? And so we went from the failures that had existed, and when I talk about the failures, we know there was over $200,000 per kid being wasted. There was a 75% recidivism rate, all types of failures that you see, and then there was the harm being caused to young people, right? So the conditions of confinement I've talked about, all the abuses that were happening, and nobody actually paying attention. And so we wanted to sort of get away from all of that, right? And then think about not only sort of the removal of things, but what are you going to put in its place, right? What are we going to strive for? And so we started sort of developing a different ecosystem of response to young people's behavior, right? And Jerry tells all the time of his stories growing up and how many things he did that his brother probably saved him from, right? But we've all had these experiences where we've done something, and for us here, probably somebody stepped up and allowed us to continue, right? And so there is a web, there is an ecosystem out there that addresses young people's behavior and doesn't lead to incarceration, right? But it just doesn't exist the same way for kids that look like me. And so the idea was, how much of that web could we artificially create as we went forward? And so we talked about sort of replacing with these 30 small facilities that had 6 to 12 beds and blah, 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 blah. But the real thing was investing in the community simultaneously, right? And so how many off-ramps do we have when a young person misbehaves or gets caught up in something, so that we can sort of wrap our arms around them, hopefully with folks that look like them and understand them and live in the same places as them, and say, hey, I got another way forward, or let's just get through the next 2 years here and you'll normalize, like things will settle down. And so New York City began funding a bunch of different things with hundreds of leaders working to create this world, right? And so we moved away from incarcerating young people and sending them upstate. There was 23 facilities that were closed upstate. It's the most closures in any one place in the nation, right? Yeah, no, it was amazing. In that process, part of what was difficult in doing that was not only sort of winning the hearts and minds and the intellectual battle, but all these upstate places where these facilities were at, no surprise to anybody here, were the economic backbone for a lot of the jobs there, right? And so there was actually a legislative agenda, a law that was in place that the union had won, where you had to give a year's notice before you closed the facility. And so what Gladys did was like, okay, you want to keep it like that? And invite the governor to an empty facility housed with just workers, because she had taken all the kids out and said, you're paying for this. And had a whole article and all this communication strategy. But that kind of sort of really throwing it back and using sort of the media and all kinds of advocacy techniques to be able to arrive at what we were trying to get at, right? And so with that, there was this sort of perfect moment where New York City realized they were paying way too much for empty beds because they had to pay a portion of it, and said, oh, we want to try to do something home, and we want to build it off of this pilot program that you guys have been doing in Brooklyn. And that was the beginning of the Close to Home legislation that happened in 2012. And literally overnight, there was buses of kids coming into New York that were in these upstate facilities and came in. And no longer were courts allowed to send the kids upstate. And it was transformational, right? It was not perfect, right? So I changed jobs then from the sort of policy advocate support to become a commissioner in New York City. Did I ever think I was going to work for government? No. And I don't know that I'll ever go back, right? But Gladys became the commissioner of the city because she wanted to finish it out. She called me up and was like, I need you. And I said, okay, I believe in you. Let's do it. And so all of a sudden I got made responsible for making this work now, right? Because it's one thing to do this transfer, it's another thing to make sure that it works. And so I had to help build this out. When I got there, kids, because they're kids, were walking right out of these places because when we said non-secure, they were non-secure. So like the door was open. And I was like, well, you can make it a little secure, like just put the lock on, like come on. And so we started just working with each other to try to figure out, okay, how can we make this successful while still staying true to our values and norms that brought us, right? And one of the biggest things for us was to have families and young people connect, right? And there's work to be done there, right? And so how do we support that work to be done so that if there's repair that needs to happen, it happens. If there's growth that needs to happen, it happens. If there's just resources that need to be given, that they're there. We can move to the next slide. So this slide talks about some of the stuff that was happening around us in terms of some of the other programming in the community that I was talking about. So a lot of these things were like either probation or our social service department started funding these community programs where young people would have. And part of it was Gladys had gone to the judges and said, hey, I don't want you sending kids upstate right before we change the legislation because they're getting harmed, right? And so she scared them. She said, if you send them up here, they're going to get hurt, right? And the judges got some conscious and were like, wait, what are you saying? And she's like, yeah, until I fix this, you're putting those kids at jeopardy. And so it's like, well, we need alternatives. And that was an opportunity for us to go and build this sort of ecosystem where young people who were arrested, there was all these other resources that were available in the community that they could access. Again, none of these are perfect. I want to sort of go, let's go to not the next slide, the font. Well, that slide gives you a sense of, what the houses look like, right? And so you imagine the differences, and these photos don't even do them full justice, but you go around, like I was just at one of them on 162nd in the Bronx. Like they are in the middle of the communities that these young people live. One of the stories is that we placed one of the kids across the street from his home, and so obviously he would just go home all the time. Literally, we're like, it's a little too close to home. Probably need to move him a little bit. But the idea was, right, like we could reframe. So we could go to the next slide. So even though the idea was that we were going to transform the youth justice system and that we were going to close prisons, really underlying this was the idea of proving that prisons did not need to exist at all, right? And so we spent a lot of money building these alternatives and made them as humane and good, but anytime you're removing a young person from their home, it's artificial and dangerous, right? And I don't want to walk away from that as a consequence. But what really you got to see was that as we did this, and everybody that was becoming part of it, young people started to enter system a lot less. And so there was a decarcerative impact to the closing of these prisons. And so we went from that 1,000 young people that were going to last year at any given day, there was 60 kids. Right? And then somebody will go, oh, what about the more dangerous? Well, okay, there's a small section of folks because New York statute is horrible for high-level crimes. But those are 60 kids there too. So 120, let's say, from that 1,000, right? So we've reduced quite a bit. I'm trying to get them to close these that I created as well because I don't think they need them population-wise, and I've gotten resistance because of the pandemic and folks saying, oh, well, the court cases are clogged and we need to wait and see, and there's a rise in crime. I haven't seen it. There are definitely issues targeted that we need to address, but nothing that requires us to keep this kind of funding for the infrastructure that we have in New York City. I think what we've proven is that there's another way to go about addressing young people's behavior that doesn't require us, one, removing them from home, and when you do remove from home, it could be a totally different experience for that young person, right? And we can be held accountable, right, as we go. And so I don't want to leave you thinking that everything was perfect, right? Like I said, there's been narrative going around, creeping back in New York, the super predator stuff, kids with guns, shooting everybody. And there are violent things that are happening. But from a kid from the 80s, I have perspective. It's not the 80s, right? And even then, they weaponized that so that kids like me would end up in these upstate institutions. So we have to hold the line, both sharing data, which we used to be good at winning, and now they're reverted back to sort of that most violent action against the data to scare folks. And so this sort of approach to dismiss the data by showing this bad thing that happened to somebody. A lot of times people will ask, well, what happens to the murderer? Like, don't we have to incarcerate a murderer? That's a conversation we have to continue to have, right? We can't just sort of land on like, there's always going to be an exception and we always have to imprison a person, right? Our system is still incredibly racist, 95% black, brown, right? We've made no effect on the racism of the system. Leadership changes, Gladys left, there's no longer the sort of the impetus, and so one of the best things leaders can do is do things that you can't undo. So I'm working in Texas right now, and they closed one of their prisons there for juveniles, and they've made it a workforce development place. And one of the things I was like, well, if you're going to keep it open, we got to do something to be able to close this, to make sure that if you were removed. And he says, I got it. And took all the really heavy custom-made doors that keep it secure, and took them out to the junkyard, got rid of them, and therefore that place, to be able to change that would cost astronomical amount of money to make it back into. And so you do things like that to be able to do that. Yes, okay. And I guess the last thing is just keep asking ourselves, how do we hold each other accountable for success, right? And so, you know, there's some good stories, but honestly, there's still lots left to do. So thank you for your time.
Hi, everybody. My name is Michelle Fay. My current job title is Justice Liaison for United Healthcare's Medicaid plan in Hawaii, but I am definitely not here in my official capacity. I guess, if anything, the exact opposite. So, I guess since the pandemic happened, and you know, I ended up here, and then that actually kind of just shuttled us to moving to Hawaii, because when I was coming to this conference, I had thought, well, you know, I've always been trying to make this dream of moving to Hawaii happen. You know, we've already kind of laid some groundwork out there. It seems kind of crazy, but, you know, since I'm going to California, we'll, you know, go to Hawaii afterwards. And so, you know, I had flown here and then and landed and called Jerry, and he was like, "What are you doing here?" You know, but it did, you know, I was just like, well, yeah, we're going to Hawaii. Like, it's like, I think this was also at a time when the East Coast was so far behind where the West Coast was, you know. And so at that point, I had been working at a program called the Nurse Family Partnership as a nurse home visitor, working with, I would say probably 95% of my clients were undocumented Latina women. To qualify for the program, you have to be a first-time parent. All my clients were women. 95% of them were Latina women, and yeah, probably about 95% of them undocumented and also monolingual Spanish-speaking. And so when we got to Hawaii, I was still working that job, but then ended up having to leave it as much as I loved it, because as the pandemic progressed, we were required to go back to the office, and I couldn't fake anymore that I was going to go to the office in Corona, Queens from Honolulu, Hawaii. And so that's how I ended up in my current position. So I know Colin had asked me to speak a little bit about my experience in Hawaii working with the justice-involved population. And, I want to say, I guess, first of all, in terms of being on this panel, I feel like there's something about being a panelist on this panel that would make you think that we are at the forefront. We are the ones, pushing forward and transformative change. And obviously, that's not at all the case, right? And I think back a lot to moments when I think we all resist change. And where do we find then opportunities to get over that, and then to kind of go beyond ourselves and to dream big? And I do see it in Hawaii, though. It's part of it's a huge part of the reason why I had wanted to move to Hawaii, because I had the sense that, at least compared to what I was used to as somebody born and raised in New York City my entire life, I knew kind of one way of being, and even in different circles, New York was what I knew, but Hawaii was totally different. But it did feel to me that there was something different about the way that people in Hawaii relate to each other. And I think a big chunk of that is, we all live in the most remote part of the world. And so we have to rely on each other, right? There's always the sense that, if anything happens, we are 3 days cut off from food supplies, and 90% of our food is imported, even though you would think of Hawaii as a place with all the resources to be able to sustain itself. The history of colonialization has obviously made that a very different story. And so I'm still very new to Hawaii, and so I don't claim to be an expert in it at all, but I do feel really honored that in my short time here, I have been able to work on issues that I really care about in ways that feel familiar to me, and also ways that are different, right, as I'm learning a new community. And that's amazing. And I think, some of, I guess, my observations of being in Hawaii so far is that I feel like that, when we talk about transformational change, a lot of times I think about just our everyday interactions with each other and how strikingly different they are from what I knew in New York, and the promise that sometimes can bring, right? And I love New York. I'm always going to be a New Yorker. And then at the same time, I feel like there are many things that I've just kind of been like, wow, we do it better in Hawaii, Everything from when you all reach a stop sign, there's always a traffic jam because everybody's just urging the other person to go through, If you're at an intersection and the light turns green and you are distracted on your phone, nobody will honk at you. We'll all just wait until the light circles back to red again and see if it happens, when it turns green again. And there's something about all of that I find really refreshing, right? It's not the kind of courtesy or graciousness that we tend to extend to each other in New York. And I've been really grateful to kind of have been invited into circles that I didn't think would be open to me, especially working with a lot of community-based groups who are targeting issues faced by Native Hawaiians. And yes, as Colin mentioned, in Hawaii, blacks are definitely overrepresented in the criminal legal system, but the biggest group overrepresented are Native Hawaiians, and probably with the second being Micronesians, who we do not talk enough about. But when I'm in these circles, what I see is that there are so many among us who have an alternate vision already, right? It's really clear. They have blueprints that we've drawn up for what a different vision of the criminal legal system could be, one that potentially could be rooted more in Native Hawaiian values, that offers different modalities, including different cultural practices and healing practices that really welcome people back into the community, and that, ideally keep them in the community to begin with, and so that we can, like the work that Yumi has been doing. He's my yummy, but I know he's really Yumi. That people have been working on, and I think because there's this sense that radical change is really our only other option at this point, right? Like, we've tinkered with things enough. Nothing's really gotten better, and we can't really keep wasting time. And so it's been really interesting, I guess, at least for me, to see the ways in which people are really putting out positions that I think other people would really regard as crazy, in a lot of ways, but that they are not just entertained, but that we talk seriously about them, and that they do involve, completely abolishing the criminal legal system as we now have it, starting from anew, and oftentimes with people like the commissioner for, I guess, our Department of Public Safety, which oversees both the law enforcement and correctional, and that as much as we can have different opinions on it, I see people talking with kind of almost a gentleness about it, and everybody, not everybody, but many people legitimately, really, honestly saying, I see where you're coming from, I see what we're struggling with. I just think we're approaching it from different ways, but how can we work this out, right? And I feel like that spirit, that's that orientation of, we're starting from a spirit of, how do we work this out? How do we make it better? But also, how do we not compromise what we're fighting for? And it's just a very different way from what I know from being in New York. But I think it's been really promising to see, and I think there are so many lessons to be learned, even if you look at what's happened in Maui, right, and the way that the community has come together, and also the way that they're struggling with really hard questions, right, if we're reopening Lahaina, if we're reopening West Maui, what does that mean for the people who have yet to go back to their homes, and are we talking about rebuilding already? Are we talking about giving us more time to heal? When we're talking about rebuilding, what does that look like? Are we trying to go back to the tourist economy that, has propped up our entire system, and honestly, we can't survive for long, without it right now? And do we want to use this opportunity to really try to create something better? Shit's literally burned to the ground, where do we go from here? And those are really serious and really honest conversations that I see going on, and they're not fakes, right? And all of that, I think, it brings me a lot of just wonder and excitement, I guess, about it. And I think, I've seen the community come together in a way that's similar around, I don't know how much news about the fuel tank leakages in Honolulu and Oahu have made it to the contiguous 48, but the Navy stores 27,000 gallons of jet fuel right above our aquifers, right? And since 2014, they've been leaking, and the Navy has lied about it every single time, and they've been continuously leaking, obviously endangering our water supply. And if there's anything that people in Hawaii are serious about, it's our water, right? Last year, I think it was last year, it got so bad that people who were living on the Army and Navy bases over there were seeing petroleum come out of their kitchen sinks. That children were getting sick. And there's photographic and video evidence of it. It's really obvious. And even through that, the Navy was lying and saying that it wasn't happening. And, people kept on saying, well, fine, you've been wanting the Navy to shut down this Red Hill facility, but, we can't do it. Our national security is at stake because, we are this military strategic location, and we need these fuel tanks to be available. And lo and behold, the community has really come together. The person, I think I shared this with Jerry, the chief of the Board of Water Supply, who's kind of this like nerdy engineer guy, is the one who, is totally head down, but really leading the charge against the military and the Department of Health, to really make huge, huge changes. And after a year of the Navy saying that it could never be done, now, and there's a lot of hemming and hawing, and there's been a lot of disciplinary action, which I think in some ways has been surprising against the Navy leadership for handling the situation so badly, that they actually are defueling the tanks, something that most engineers themselves, and lots of government officials had said they would never do, is actually being done. And I think that is so much, the credit of how the community really comes together, and that's awesome. And then going back, I think, when I think about, thank you, the time that I've had in Hawaii, I also think to the moms that I've worked with at the Nurse Family Partnership, because I think of Hawaii in lots of ways in terms of just like, okay, we're so poised and so ready, and we're really working towards institutional change, systems change, like societal change. And with the moms that I worked with, so I think the last time I saw many of you, I had left my job as the executive director of the Immigrant Defense Project and was convinced I was going to become a home birth midwife. And I went to nursing school in order to go to midwifery school, and then dropped out of midwifery school because it didn't seem like I could structure a practice that really focused on low income, of color, and immigrant communities in the home birth setting as I had hoped it might be. And I had heard of this program, which I thought was really exciting. And again, like Yumi said, it's not a radical outfit, right? But it was this program, it is this program called the Nurse Family Partnership, where first-time moms on Medicaid, and I should say parents, though like I said, all of my clients were moms, get assigned to a community health nurse, right? Which is what I did. And what my role was to go spend time with these moms in their homes from the time they were pregnant until their babies turned 2 years old. So I really got to spend 3 years, with these moms, and I got to know so much about them. And they deal with really complicated shit, but what always struck me, and I don't think strikes even the program, the Nurse Family Partnership, enough, is how much of hustlers these women are, right? Like, so, I think most of us think of birth, becoming a parent, all of that stuff as a moment for transformational change when we're thinking about us individually, and there's plenty of that among the moms that I worked with. But there was also so much just ass-kicker spirit among them to really demand change, right? To know that, for example, because I got to talk with my moms about anything and everything, right? I would see them every week or every 2 weeks, and I could spend hours with them, and we would just talk about and work on whatever mattered to them, right? So I didn't have to have like a very set nursing agenda, that I had to work through with them. It was whatever they needed is what we tried to target. And so I got to see them in action in ways that, for example, the Nurse Family Partnership would provide information about, okay, here's how you introduce solids, and it was the most basic information, right? Anybody can Google that information. My clients can Google that information just as easily as anybody else can. But they knew that, that there was different information that the moms in Park Slope were getting than the moms that were in Corona Queens were getting, right? And in Park Slope, it's totally fine if you want to co-sleep with your baby. If you're in Corona, that's a risk for SIDS and your baby dying for you not being responsible enough, right? And they would be like, and they would, if we were going to be talking about hospital births, lots of times they'd be like, I hear that a lot of these white women, they want to give birth at home. Tell me about that, When they dealt with birth violence, a lot of them were the ones to raise with me, like, what can I do? We talked about asserting my rights, right? I feel like my rights were violated. Let's move ahead, I want to see what we can do. And, and of course, their undocumented status was not anything that was news to them. But I think it was just what was so great about working with these women was that you're catching them at a time when they want so much transformational change, right? They're envisioning a better world for their children. They're full of imagination, right? And just, like I said, a spirit of the shit's not working, want to do better, and let's move on it, And I think that we can learn a lot if we can, like we've always said, right, in all of our work in Rebellious Learning, if we stop and we listen to them more and we recognize how much they already know, right, and we don't underestimate what they want to change and what they're capable of and how much further they want to go. And I feel like if we are able to kind of harness those moments, right, I think our next question is just how do we scale it up, right? How do we make this for everyone? I'll stop here.
Thank you.
It's such an honor to be here. I'm a law professor, and so, in large part because of the multiple interventions of Jerry Lopez at various times. And in my role as a law professor, I have spoken at a lot of symposiums, at a lot of law schools. It's a core part of what I do, and I have never been on a panel like this. This has been so inspiring, and of course, I wouldn't expect anything less at an event that's going to acknowledge and honor Jerry, but it has just been such a pleasure to be here. So I know I don't have very much time. We're kind of towards the end of our session, right? Okay, so I don't have very much time, and I'll try to keep my comments short. I'm so glad I had an opportunity to just be asked to acknowledge the transformative changes that you have marshaled and inspired, Jerry. I'm a law professor, I'm a clinician, so I have active clients. I lawyer every day. And my clients call and work for fundamental change on both large and small scales. My clients are not confused about the issues. They are not confused about the problems in their community and what is impacting their life. And they know what needs to change. So what I do as a transactional lawyer is I help my clients design and then implement the futures that they want to see. So part of the call of our panel is to think about, well, what makes change so hard? Because from my perspective, all my clients are actively engaged in struggle, actively engaged in abolitionist movements. And in part, it's because my clients are working within institutions, and institutions exist within systems, industries, and those industries exist within larger ecosystems, economies. And so that is part of what makes change so difficult. So just to give a more concrete example of the type of transformative change that my clients are engaged in on a small scale, and I say small, but I in no means mean insignificant. But on a small scale, some of the transformative change would be, for example, I have a client that wanted to see and deeply believed in living wage employment for unskilled labor in San Francisco, one of the most expensive cities to live in the world. So what the client did is the client started a printing business, and the sole purpose of that printing company was to then hire unskilled labor from marginalized groups individuals with criminal records, individuals with substance dependencies, individuals that do not have high school diplomas or a GED equivalent, individuals that our society has deemed or relegated as unemployable. And my client hires them and pays them competitive wages with a goal of living wages in this very, very expensive city. And then actively promotes from within the workforce so that individuals who start, literally like on the floor printing shirts and T-shirts, then move up and are managing customer clients or customer accounts. Right, so this is transformative change. Right, the lives of these employees and their immediate families are drastically changed as a result of being hired and working in this position with my client. Right, they have access to dignified employment. They have opportunities for professional advancement, and they get to remain in their cities, in their communities, in their homes. So there's no doubt that that this is transformative change, but I'm saying it's the small scale transformative change because of course my client hasn't ended issues of mass incarceration, hasn't ended over policing in Black Brown communities, hasn't changed low quality education or the need for more affordable housing in the city where they live. So there's still all of these big systemic issues, but for these 50 to 100 employees that have worked at my client's business, their lives have been drastically and transformative change. So transformative change is happening around us, but it's measured differently, right? We have to think about how it's being measured. So I wanted to also just quickly give an example of some of the larger transformative change that my clients are engaged in. Because transformation is complicated and it requires continuous progress, right? So this is a sort of a stylized client narrative trying to illustrate this point, and in order to do it, I have to give you some of the deep history of this community because we know that that's necessary when thinking about how to collaborate with subordinated populations. So my client now, I'm just going to refer to it as the cooperative. My client, the cooperative, the individuals that formed my client started working together. They were organizing together in the late 1960s with the United Farm Workers, and this were geographically located in the Central Coast. So they were farm worker families, and they were organizing for dignified employment, and they were in the process of striking against a local agricultural company. But recall, this is in the 60s, so the agricultural company also owned the plot of land that they lived on, and the families lived on. So it's not just their employer, it's also their landlord. So as a means of retaliation, the landlord ends up transferring the property to a new owner, and then the new owner is able to then evict all of these striking families. So then what starts as a movement for dignified employment turns into an immediate need for housing. So there's over 30 families now that are just evicted overnight. It was like incredibly traumatic and brutal. Police are brought out, just as you can imagine. But these families, again, very much engaged in struggle, very much engaged in transformative change as an act of defiance, remain visible and remain on the street. So they refused. I think there were a couple different intervention to try to put them in shelters and try to hide what was going on, try to get it out of the spotlight, and the community refuses. So they're living on the streets, they're living in cars and vans, and they are bringing attention to what is going on. This goes on for a while, and the evicted families decide, because they're organizing together, they decide what they're going to do is they are going to move into abandoned government barracks in the community. And the story behind the barracks is also interesting. So this is is government labor camp, right? So think back to the Braceros movement that was going on in the early 1900s and into like the 30s and into the 50s. The same labor camp was actually used as a relocation center during World War II, where Japanese and Japanese Americans were processed through internment camps. So it was like one of the visitor centers that were used. So it's a very racialized space, but it has since been abandoned because now we're in the late 60s, and it's just gone into disarray. And it had been the ownership of the land had been transferred from the federal government to now the county government owns these abandoned barracks. So the families decide they first tried to negotiate to just get access. Can we just get permission to live there? Of course, they're not given permission, so they end up just taking it, right? They end up just squatting. This is like another recurrent theme, right? Just doing things without the law, quote unquote, the law being on the client's side. So they take over the barracks. This ends up turning into a multi-year process to then get ownership to the land, which they are eventually able to do. They then form a housing cooperative. This is now, we're talking about the mid-70s. There were no models to do what they were trying to do. They were really sort of setting the blueprint for then what became a really successful cooperative farm housing model that other communities have since adopted. And as I mentioned, in many, many ways, this has been a success story because the client still remains and they still remain owners, and many of the families that currently live at the housing cooperative are still the direct descendants of this first group of striking farm workers that created the cooperative. So in many ways, a success story, but systems are complicated. So even though they owned the land, what eventually ended up happening is that their water was poisoned because the water was owned by a private company. And so then it became a decade-long fight to get access to safe, potable water. And this is then where, into present day, where they work with me and they work with my clinic to gain acquisition. So we're going through an acquisition of the water system. So we've had to do tons of due diligence. We have to write the documents. We have to get easements released and added. I mean, there's just a lot that's going on. So one of the questions was, why does abolition, why does it take long? Like, why aren't we asking for it sooner? And why aren't more people doing it? And just briefly, this is how I'm going to end. What I would say is that there were real obligations of the government agency that we have in place. So my client has been very clear what they want. They want ownership of the water system, but that ownership is going to come with risk and liabilities, which rightfully at this point belong to the county. So the county needs to do the work that they need to do. It has taken years, and the county is doing the work, but it's taken years for them to do the work to make it an asset that makes sense for my client to then require. So part of the reason that it takes change is because the government is slow. Okay, so there's that. Then the other part of this, to Amari's point, is that leadership, like who is in power, makes a big difference. In terms of really advancing change, it's not just about the quantity of the will of the people in terms of the groundswell of the people. It takes leadership that is non-defensive, willing to partner, willing to rethink, and to really center the institution's impact on community, and separate that from the intention of the institution. Really think about what the impact is. And then the last point I will just make is that finances. With the way finances work, the way the economy works, is that the wealth gap is very, very real, and it means that my clients are at a structural disadvantage, which requires them to raise outside funding to be able to do the type of transformative work that they want to do. And we can, of course, you guys can think about all of the obstacles to raising outside funding. So these, I think, are some of the reasons why we don't see more of it. But transformative change is definitely happening around us.
I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to my fellow panelists, Craig, Yumari, Michelle, and Alina. This was awesome. Thank you again. I have the mic for just one more minute. I want to present Jerry with a blanket. Jerry, would you join me right down here so I can present a penalty? It's actually not a penalty. We don't do penalties anymore. This blanket is from, we used to still give Pendleton blankets, which are sort of the classic. Let me keep it folded. Oh, you want to show it? Yeah. This is 8th generation. This is a native-owned company. The Pendleton blankets, which have been the traditional sort of native gifts, is not native-owned. But this is, and this is called a warrior blanket. Very suitable for presentation to Mr.